Good morning. Can I welcome everybody to the 32nd meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2013, and also can I remind everybody present to ensure that all electronic devices, particularly mobile phones, are switched off at all times because they interfere with the broadcasting system. Moving on to our first item today, that is an item to decide whether to take item 4 in private, which is to consider our work programme. Do members agree to take item 4 in private? Okay, thank you. Our next item is to hold a one-off evidence session on outdoor learning, which has been in our work programme for some time. This will be the first time this session that we have taken evidence on this subject. As members will be aware, there's been a fair amount of interest in today's meeting, and can I thank everyone who submitted their views in writing to the committee in advance of this morning's meeting. And can I welcome to the committee this morning Christine Anderson, who is from Beeslack Community High School, Professor Peter Higgins from the University of Edinburgh, Nigel Marshall from the Scottish Advisory Panel for Outdoor Education, and Dave Spence, who represents the Scottish Outdoor Education Centres. Can I thank you all very much for coming along this morning and giving your time to the committee. I want to move straight to questions from members because we've got a lot of interest in a lot of areas we want to cover, and I'm going to start with Liz Smith.
Good morning. Mr Marshall, in the evidence that you submitted, you made a very important point about the fact that there appears to be two different definitions. One is outdoor education and one is outdoor learning. And you also say that there appears to be a disconnect between policy as it is promoted by the government level and how it's implemented at local authority level. Could you just elaborate exactly on this problem about definitions and where you think this disconnect has come from?
Outdoor education, education to me is what we're all involved in, delivering learning as a process which we actually learn and how as part of education. So to call something outdoor learning to me seems to be a bit silly really, because it all takes place in the outdoors. And really one thing leads on to another. I don't see why we should try and differentiate between what's happening in a local area of a school, perhaps, and what's happening in a mountainside. To me, they're all part of the same thing. One's a sort of progression, if you like, of another. So, and it should happen naturally and appropriately. And that way, it would be meaningful to the children, and it would have some sort of sense to it. But to actually try and what happens professionally is that colleagues can quite conveniently decide that we are satisfying the outdoor learning agenda as defined by Scottish Government and forget that other bit is called outdoor education, and we don't need to do that. And that's a big source of concern to me, because if a young person's experience is confined to what happens in the local grounds, local school grounds, and to on the local parks and local green spaces, what a terrible thing it would be that if they never got to a mountain or to see the sea. So my entire life has been involved in making sure that young people get that thing, the whole package, if you like. And so the service that I deliver has got the local school grounds and the local green spaces, which I think is fantastic, and I really welcome it, and I think it's great what Scottish Government has done to make sure that that's actually happening. There's nobody in outdoor education, certainly not in the Scottish Advisory Panel, that has a bad word to say about that. We think that's a fantastic thing. But what we're very, very concerned about at the moment is the bit where we move on from that and we do adventurous activities and we get into mountains and over in the sea and experience boats and residential and all the other bits of this that are, I think, what Scottish Government thought they were implementing, because that's the sort of situation as I see it at the moment.
Could I ask you on that point? Obviously, the phrase outdoor learning appears very substantially within Curriculum for Excellence, and therefore it is perhaps easier, not least because it has been a government initiative, to define it. Do you feel that the difficulty with outdoor education is it is harder to define and therefore harder to get people to buy into it in the same way?
No. I think there's a one-word answer to that. I think for me, outdoor education, if you want to talk about outdoor education and what actually happens in the process of outdoor education, it's the same as what's happening in outdoor learning, but there are different things that add into the pot. There's added value there. There are things that happen in residential experience or that happen out in a sailing boat. You know, when I've been out on a boat with a group of young children, if we're preparing in the morning to go to sea, we're looking at what's the weather doing today. You know, what's the state of the tide. You know, what clothing do we need to wear? What food will we need to go? You know, what we have to take with us really to make this a success. And then there's a planning process involved in all of this. And we decide which way the wind's blowing, and then we decide where we're going with this boat. And then as we go out in that boat, we're learning about the sea. We're learning about the sun and the moon and how they affect the tide. We're learning about how we need to protect ourselves against the wind and the weather. The children are sailing the boat. I'm not sailing the boat. They're sailing the boat. So there's a whole stack of added value that goes in there. If I talk about residential, there are children that come to the centre that I manage at the moment that can't use a fork and knife. It's horrible watching children trying to eat mince and tatties with their hands because they're living in a takeaway society these days. So I'm very much concerned about that element of it, that we must address this, and some of the things, parts of that, as far as the value, the two things have equal value. I'm not trying to differentiate, but one complements the other, and each of them are both important. Hopefully examples maybe, I'm sorry if I...
No, it's very helpful. Could I just ask the other panellists how we do address this issue, because it's obviously a major one.
You mean the definitional issue?
Well, the added value concept, okay. Because I think you're probably all agreed that this outdoor education has got something that is added value. It's not that it's necessarily opposing, it's an added value situation. And you know, reading through quite a lot of the evidence here, it was very substantial evidence, there seems to be a feeling that we're less certain, particularly in getting staff and volunteers to help with that concept. And we certainly seem to be less comfortable with local authority commitment to that. And that's what I'm really trying to drive at, as to how we improve that.
Sorry, could I just say from a school's point of view, really it's progression in a way, because you are starting off with maybe doing bits and pieces outdoors and maybe in nursery school, and then you need to see this progression going through, and you'll get to the stage where the youngsters have developed quite considerable skills, and then they need to be put into more challenging situations. And I think that's really important, to try and get some cohesive system together where you've got that progression going through. Now, that is a massive task to do that, but I think, you know, that's where the crux of this lies, really.
Just mention a bit.
I think that fragmentation starts at a higher level as well. In terms of the added value, we offer benefits in terms of health and well-being, education, youth policy, sport, but it's fragmented. And it never really gets the chance to come together as a cohesive whole. We had 2 strategic advisory groups in recent years, and they haven't really created the environment in which we can operate in a strategic manner. It's still, you've seen from the submissions that there's still a lot of ad hoc work going on, one-off ideas being played out. And really, as Christine says there, it's the progression that's what we're seeking here. It's that interconnection. It's enabling young people to have different types of outdoor learning regularly and frequently. That is the goal we should be seeking to aspire to. But while ever it is fragmented in that fashion, it's remained difficult, elusive for us to come together.
Would you say that that is a problem about the discussion process as to how we improve that, or are there serious barriers in the way that are preventing policy being driven forward? Is it a communication problem, or is it a genuine...
I think we can learn from the efforts that have been made in the past and seek not to replicate those which have brought us to this position. We are not operating in a strategic way, as I mentioned, and there are reasons why that is. But I think if you look forward, there's a great deal of emphasis from things like the Christie Commission, from the Carnegie, about partnership working, about different groups working together, coming together around, coalescing around key themes. And if, you know, outdoor learning, outdoor education could be an example of how to do that, because there are so many good people out there who want to deliver high quality outdoor learning, are doing, struggling against the environment in which we do it, but they do want to come together, and we could be an exemplar for this partnership working that is being required of us today.
May I just add a few things? The first is that I think it's very helpful to not think about the outdoors as any different to the indoors, in the sense that it's just about kids learning. All right, and just as you have progression, coherence and depth expected of teachers in classrooms, the same should be true in the outdoors. And so if you take a Scandinavian example, kids will be outdoors from the age of 3, and they will spend most of their time outdoors. They will spend a lot of their curricular time outdoors throughout the whole of their school life, but they will also go on residential experiences, they'll go on camps, and indeed when they leave school, they can join folk high schools, where they will for a whole year spend their time outdoors learning. Now, to my mind, it's not a surprise that Scandinavian countries do so well with PISA scores and the rest of it. But it's an accident. It's an accident of a progressive education system. Now, Scotland has got a progressive education system. It's historically embedded, and we have done very, very well. Internationally, we are very well regarded and respected for the work that we do in the outdoors. And to my mind, we've got many other things in place. And as my colleagues have been saying here, we need to find some ways of joining this up. And the great thing that's happening at the moment is that there are efforts being made to do so. And I suspect that if we put more concerted effort into this, through from the training of teachers right through to, so they know what to expect when the kids go through the school, when they go into adventurous experiences beyond, then I think we'll be able to pull together a good progressive policy for the future.
Just finish my questions on just that very point about the training of teachers. I entirely agree with you. I think it's very refreshing to hear you say that it should be like indoor learning, exactly that. But from a perspective of teachers, and particularly those who represent the teaching trade unions, there is a reluctance for many of them to participate because they feel that there is an added risk in the outdoors, and some of them feel very uncomfortable about going through that. Do you believe that that can be addressed through teacher training, or do you think there are other things that we have to do?
First off, that's not the experience I have these days. 5 years ago, I would have agreed with you that's a concern, but much less so these days. So I'm involved in training teachers, and I'm involved in in-service work, and many of our other colleagues in teacher education institutes are as well. And there is no reluctance. It's much more a case of, do the incoming trainee teachers have the mindset to walk out the classroom door? And through doing so, they end up developing this understanding, which will lead to outdoor residential centre provision and those sorts of experiences for their students. There's no real reluctance, as I see it, amongst the trainees, other than a lack of familiarity with the outdoors. And I think the safety issues are very much overblown. There's no real concern. It's not an issue that any of us is particularly focusing on these days. So if the unions are thinking that way, then perhaps a wee bit of readjustment of their expectations would be helpful.
Could I just qualify that a little bit, because my experience is slightly different from Pete's. I would say that there is a bit of a problem for teachers that are established in school. There definitely is a little bit of concern about it in terms of the extra work that's involved in this, and whether this is going to, if they have a little accident or whatever, what's going to happen. Because parental complaints these days are fast and furious in schools. And, I see quite a lot of that in the course of my work. So what I would say is that some of the actions that have taken place recently to try and help that have been very useful. Scottish Advisory Panel, out of its meagre budget, we have £3,500 a year from our membership, and we have actually sponsored a national outdoor learning cards initiative where we actually train tutors in every authority in Scotland. And the idea of these learning cards are they're actually like lesson plans. And they've been really popular. They started out, I have to be honest with you, south of the border. The Outdoor Education Advisors Panel created these, and we've brought them north of the border, and we've implemented them, and we've actually got them out there. Now this has been welcomed by a great many teachers across Scotland. It's a reassurance. It's something that gives them a structure to get out there, something that gives them a starting point. And there has been training. We've delivered the training on that across. Last year we did a full year of it. And we've been working in association with, collaboratively with the Association of Heads of Outdoor Education Centres to try and build on that relationship to try and make a more constructive and more strategic implementation of outdoor learning in Scotland, because we are aware of as our landscape has 32 different forms, so has our local authorities, which you've seen from my submission. Right? And I would apologise for that, but you'll understand the difficulty I would have had trying to harmonise that. So where we're at with all of this is that we've got all these different landscapes, we've got all these different opportunities in there, and how these cards are fitted in there has been really good, and this collaboration has made that happen. And as well as that, we've actually created the Going Out There document in conjunction with Scottish Government and other colleagues to make sure that we're trying to enable staff, trying to give them the tools to do that. And we've done that once again through our website to try and deliver on that. We do realise that there are huge barriers, you know, for teachers, and it's to try and enable that and to try and quieten it down a wee bit. So that's sort of where we're at with it at the moment. It's a long journey, to be honest with you.
Can I, just following on from that, I just wondered whether, you mentioned, Professor Peter Higgins, the evidence from Scandinavia as an example. And I just wondered about international evidence. What evidence is there that outdoor education, instinctively you would think this makes perfect sense, and obviously this would help children in terms of their behaviour, in terms of their motivation, in terms of their attainment levels. Instinctively I would assume that's the case. But what is the international evidence that supports such a statement? Or such a view?
It's a very interesting issue because, of course, around the world there are many different models of outdoor education, outdoor learning, as there are other forms of education. But we've recently done a couple of reviews, and these have been commission reviews, specifically because of the work on the One Planet Schools group for Learning for Sustainability, on the relationship between outdoor learning and attainment. Now, the key things that came up from this really is people are always interested in whether going outdoors will help your geography. Well, that's kind of almost obvious that it would, but does it help your maths? And there's evidence that it does, and it helps your English. You know, you can imagine straight away a teacher taking kids out and doing poetry outdoors. Can you imagine a teacher taking kids out and counting the number of blades of grass on a soccer field, using mathematics and statistical sampling? So that kind of thing happens. But it's quite possible to do. But the international evidence suggests that it isn't so much the subject areas themselves that benefit the kids and their perceptions of those subject areas. It's the relationship between them. In other words, it's that big thing that's so difficult to get to that we all like in education, which is interdisciplinarity. How do you join all the dots up so that we see issues and we start to apprehend those issues and deal with those issues? And the evidence is quite strong that the outdoors provides a kind of space where those sorts of issues can be dealt with and discussed, and the kids can learn not just about the subject areas, but the way in which they join up.
Last week we had the PISA results published, and the top 5 countries in those tables were all from Southeast Asia. Do they carry out, because I only saw the news reports about it, do they carry out outdoor education? It looked like the kids were in school about 14 hours a day.
Well, I think they are. They're in school 14 hours a day, a lot. But they also have remarkably extensive provision for outdoor learning. Now, I don't want to suggest that outdoor learning is a direct line to PISA scores. To be frank, I'm not particularly bothered about PISA scores because PISA scores measure certain kinds of intelligences and certain approaches to education and learning. The way in which they approach their work in Southeast Asia is essentially towards the very things that will do very well in terms of the PISA scores, but not the rest of the world. You know, there are other countries that do. But I gave the Scandinavians as an example because they've always done very well in PISA, not always the top. But they have a much more progressive and broader education system. So, of course, they speak 3 or 4 languages and. So I would much rather not focus just on PISA scores. And I think in broad education terms, it's one element of child development, but it's not the whole thing. And PISA actually does absolutely nothing in terms of trying to assess understanding of interdisciplinary issues, because everything's compartmentalised. So Southeast Asia does it. There's a lot of interest, and I spent quite a bit of time in Singapore working with people there using the outdoors, and it's deemed to be something that's core to what they're doing in terms of their curricular development because of the range and of the personal development outcomes that they see from the outdoors, as well as these interdisciplinary issues.
And Liam MacArthur at this stage.
Just following up Professor Higgins's points there in terms of the value. I mean, it strikes me that convincing certain children of the relevance of what they're learning to real life experience is a challenge that many teachers face, and outdoor education, outdoor learning allows that to be bridged. And as somebody who represents Orkney, experience of the sea and mountains and all the rest of it is not really a problem. As soon as they step out of school or on the way home, they're going to be bumping into that. Outdoor education is about urban environments, exposing those from rural communities to more urban environments. Is as much about that outdoor education as hills and rivers and sea and all the rest of it, presumably.
It certainly is, and to me, the real benefits in terms of the issue you're exploring here is around issues like taking responsibility for your own actions, this understanding that there are consequences to what you do and how you do them, and also perhaps getting a sense of place. Now, of course, not everyone lives in a rural environment within Scotland, and urban environments is the kind of places that kids experience daily, and we need to find ways of getting them out of the classroom so they understand their urban environments. And there's a lot to be said for example, flipping kids from Orkney into the centre of Glasgow and vice versa, so that they can then see the way in which other people live. But to me, the issue of how you get kids to understand their place, their sense of place within Scotland, involves the community of the city and the community of the Highlands and Islands. And in terms of making it real and relevant to them, yes, responsibilities and understanding the consequences of actions, wherever they might be, are important.
Can I just make a couple of comments? We had a Japanese lady who came to our centre and interviewed me relating to outdoor education, and I know she went to Edinburgh University and she spoke with our colleagues throughout Scotland. She was extremely interested in what we were doing in leadership to do with skills development, and since then she's been constantly bombarding me with emails trying to get more and more information out of us, because they don't have a programme like that. They have fantastic students who are well educated, and then they end up moving away from their homeland, their home city or wherever. They end up in another city, and they literally work the 12-hour day, and they're locked in a little room, and their whole life becomes what they can do on the internet and going to work. So they have no social life whatsoever. And in Japan at the moment, my understanding is that they're trying to get these young people, they're young professionals, engaged in communities and so on. So there's a big initiative there, and one of the ways they see as a way forward is looking at skills development. And she came and was very interested in the programme we were doing. It's another side of residential that we do that's very powerful, is looking at skills for learning, skills for life, and skills for work. And if we don't do that, we're missing out. And it's a big part of what we're about. I live in an island. I've lived there for 35 years, and it never ceases to amaze me how many young people don't go to sea and how many of them don't go up mountains. They thirst for the other side. In fact, they call the island where I live the Rock, and they're constantly trying to escape off it. I'm sure it's the same in Orkney. So unless they come to us, we cannot get them up. They don't go up Goat Fell, which is the highest mountain in the island. They don't go into the environment unless there are clubs that are actually involved in organising it for them. They're reluctant to get involved. They thirst for the bright lights. So in actual fact, unless it's structured and created for them in some sort of way, it's quite difficult to get them engaged in that environment. Sorry, Mr MacArthur, but that's my experience and my own son was much the same. He wanted to go and play rugby, so that's the way it was. So hopefully that maybe is a counter or whatever that one.
Yes, I'd just comment on that it's incredibly important for young people from cities to experience the other 95% of Scotland which isn't urbanised, and that's particularly the case when we get suggestions that there is going to be a shortfall in the labour force working in the outdoors in the future. And so it is important that they experience things out with the city. But it goes the other way too, because lots of children in rural areas are quite restricted about where they can go because of farmland and other land use practices. And so there are opportunities, as I think Peter said, of young people coming to, say, the Belt area or the cities, and in terms of your, the last question you asked about sustainability, perhaps there's more needs to be done about appreciating the interconnection between the city and the rural areas. And outdoor education can achieve that for all of those children.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you. It's really a question for Professor Higgins. European and External Relations Committee has just been done an inquiry into language teaching in schools, and one of the things that we discovered very quickly is local authorities don't have any information about what teachers have language skills, particularly in the primary school area. So I was interested because you say that few schools in your submission, few schools and staff have specialist knowledge of qualifications. So on what are you basing that?
Few school staff have specialist qualifications in outdoor learning. Is that yeah?
How have you've said what you've said is few schools have staff with specialist knowledge or qualifications. Yes, yeah. So I want to know how you've arrived at that, because it's quite a dramatic statement about it.
Yeah, and it's easy to substantiate that because the General Teaching Council has a set of expectations for those of us who are teachers in terms of meeting the professional standards. And there are various tiers. And so the standard for full registration includes the possibility that you can have an outdoor educational qualification. Now, I happen to have one because I trained in Wales. So I left Scotland to go to Wales to train to be a teacher of outdoor education. I came back to Scotland and I couldn't get registered with the General Teaching Council when I came back initially. I did in the end. And I'm involved in the process of accrediting people to become accredited teachers of outdoor education. And there are very, very few who go through annually, maybe one or two. Now, the reason for this is because there's no standard teaching qualification within Scotland, so there's nothing for them to compare this with. Now, it's not that they're not sympathetic to it. They're actually very sympathetic, and they would love to have more people coming through asking for exceptional registration and various other standards of registration. And it's interesting because it's going to become part of, in fact, is already part of the professional standards now. So the revised professional standards include leadership, values, and learning for sustainability, and all teachers have to have these. Learning for sustainability includes outdoor learning. So we have a bit of an impasse here. The GTCS is saying this must happen, and yet teachers are not being trained in order to be able to deliver those three areas. That's leadership, values, and learning for sustainability, particularly the latter. And learning for sustainability has a skill set, and that includes outdoor learning. So at the moment, there's very little there. There are specialist qualifications in the outdoor activities that many teachers will have, but these tend to be the province of the outdoor centre. So the places that these guys work in, I used to work in, that they have specialist skills in a range of different outdoor activities, but they're outdoor activities. So this is the equivalent of a PE teacher having a netball qualification or a cricket qualification or a rugby qualification. They're not about the core issue of how you train people to work in the outdoors with young people. So I can say that with really quite a high degree of confidence.
I just follow this up. I'll bring in Christine in a moment, but I just want to the statement in the evidence was about both knowledge and qualifications. Now, these are two entirely different things, clearly. You concentrated your answer on qualifications quite rightly because we can quantify those relatively easily. But knowledge is maybe slightly more difficult to quantify. In your statement, you said that we didn't have it. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but what makes you say that?
That's a very fair point. And the confidence issue is partly because of a lack of experience. There are relatively few schools taking very many kids out to do very many things. Now, this is increasing. We've done some research over the last few years which has shown that particularly in primary schools, and credit to the Scottish Government and Education Scotland for pushing the outdoor learning agenda, in many primary schools, teachers are now much more confident in using the school grounds and just a short walk beyond the school grounds. This has been also facilitated by some in-service training of teachers, which Education Scotland organised and we were involved in. So all that's going very well. Secondary teachers are much less likely to do so because of the curricular demands on their time, but particularly in years S1 to S3, there's much more opportunity to do so. And what we're finding now from our research, and this is research over 4 different geographical areas within Scotland, so it's reasonably consistent, is that there's a keenness, a willingness, but just a sense of lack of confidence to do so. So, again, I can go some way towards helping provide an answer for that. It's not widespread across the whole of the country, but it's indicative.
Supplementary?
Very, very quickly, from what you've said, I hear very clearly what you're saying, but the only experience as firstly as a counsellor and then as an MSP, is that in secondary schools, what tends to happen is experts are brought in to deliver this, people that are delivering Duke of Edinburgh Awards, working with the John Muir Trust. Is that not more likely to happen for secondary schools, especially in the 4th and 5th years?
It happens with primary and secondary, and these collaborative partnerships exist throughout. I think the thing we have to be really careful about, though, is that we don't see that as a proxy for teachers understanding the whole educational transaction that the outdoors can provide. Because, of course, there's an equity issue. Some schools will be able to do that, and some schools won't. So I don't think it's appropriate and fair to think that everything's going to be sorted if we bring in the John Muir Award, or we bring in the RSPB to do some work, or the local ranger service. Some schools will do that, and what you tend to find is that schools that are very, very good at developing these sorts of relationships develop more, and they develop more and more and more, and you get little examples of really high quality work where you couldn't fault it in any way, but then there are other schools where it doesn't happen, and you need to make sure that all children across the whole of Scotland are getting fair provision, in my mind.
Christine, there's a lot of stuff there about schools, obviously. Just ask, I'm quite happy for you to answer any of that, but I mean, I just wanted to ask a specific question, which goes back to where we started on this. How do you know in a school the qualifications of teachers which are not directly related to the job that they do? If you have a maths teacher, as I had, who happened to be a grade 1 rugby referee and did other things, you know, so how do you know about the interests and knowledge and experience of teachers in
I think it's
schools?
a case of that would probably come through maybe as part of the interview process when they're applying for the job, and then after that, when they're in school, it's a case of you talk to people, you make sure as a senior manager, you know, regularly we keep things like outdoor learning on in our discussions that we have. Recently, we have something called At Homes, where teachers go and visit different departments and they get to hear about what's happening there. Now, in the programme that we did in May, 2 departments offered information on what they're doing in outdoor learning, and it's through these kinds of things that you actually get to know other qualifications that teachers have got. Because I have a personal interest in it, I'm always keen to know when we get new members of staff coming in, you know, what do you do outdoors and have you taken children out? And really it's a case of trying to give them freedom to go and explore and do things, but we have to keep a very tight rein on it in terms of there's one person in our school, which happens to be me, who's overseeing everything so that you know when you've got trips going out, so that you can get the proper risk assessment in place, so that you can advise teachers, well, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? And one person really sort of managing it. And then from that, the information I gain, I'll have meeting with staff and say, well, so-and-so has been out and done this. Can we get links there with other departments? We've also done quite a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, and when that sort of takes off, other things spring from it. Thinking about the John Muir Award, that started off in school as we did a week of John Muir activities, as you will have seen from the paper. We've now got that into the curriculum in first year, and they're actually, the first years are doing a rota where they're going around 4 different subject areas: art, music, ICT, or computing skills, I should say, and also art and design, okay? And they're going outside, they're doing things outside, then they're bringing it back into the classroom. You might say, well, how can they do that in computing studies? But what they're actually doing is they're looking at what happens to the computers when we've finished with them. and how youngsters are in other countries are actually scrounging for the bits of computer so they can sell it to actually make money to live. And that has had a really big impact on our first years doing that. At the end of this whole process, after they've gone through the research of it and investigated things, they then write a postcard to John Muir explaining what they found out about this. So it's a nice little thing that's sort of linked up. We've now got progression from that going through forest skills. We've called it forest skills and not forest schools because we don't actually have the resources to do forest schools at the moment. So they go from first year where they've got this experience of John Muir and then forest skills in second year where they're actually working in the woodlands that are around the school and setting up mini beast traps and things like that. So I think to go back to your original question, it has to be, as a senior leader, you have to have your ears open and you have to have your finger on the pulse and you have to be making the very best use of the staff that you've got. One thing that I will say is that it still is driven to a large extent by people that are enthusiastic about doing this kind of thing, and there is still work to be done with other teaching staff who maybe are not quite as passionate about this kind of thing. Okay.
Before we bring it here, I've got other members want to come in, so I'm going to bring them in first. Okay, Colin, BT.
Thank you, Convener. I'm looking at comments that have been made in various submissions as regards the consistency in the approach to outdoor learning and, or more correctly, perhaps the lack of it. How common is it actually for schools in Scotland to offer a diverse programme of outdoor learning? And touching on the rural-urban split, is there a significant difference in approach in an urban environment in terms of outdoor learning as opposed to a rural one? Or do the urban guys all want to go out into the rural area and experience that in the same way?
I'll just say that the Scottish Advisory Panel, the membership there is by far in a way mainly school-based. There are only a few of us that are probably engaged in outdoor centres. So they're actually out there supporting. They are advisors in each authority, and their responsibility is to support schools and through a strategy. There have been local authority strategies have been drawn up for outdoor learning, and the majority of authorities have got these in place now, and they've got these strategy groups in these authorities, and they're trying to implement a plan of outdoor learning. Now, that will vary dependent on the environment it's in. So if it's someone who's an urban-based outdoor educationalist who's acting on behalf, who's an advisor there, they'll be doing the best they can with the resources that they've got at their disposal to implement that plan and to support schools strategically, rather than some of them will get involved hands-on and will deliver, but the majority of them are trying to organise and pull things together. And but it does vary. And then in a more rural environment, it'll be completely different. They may have a more hands-on situation where they are instructing, they are delivering a programme of outdoor learning through curriculum for excellence and so on. So it's very much dependent on the environment where they are and how many people they've got and the resources they've got available to them. And that is extremely disparate, as you're saying, in the submission that I made. That's the issue, to be honest with you.
You wanted to come in a moment ago.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I was just going to make a plea really for other schools. There are a lot of small to medium-sized schools in Scotland, and I think that the phrase the word I think of when I think about what they want and what they're looking for is diversity. No two schools are the same, and in those small to medium-sized schools, because of a combination of age structure of teaching staff, some of whom are elderly, some of whom are new, what they can do one year in terms of outdoor learning is not necessarily the same as they can do in subsequent years. So we've worked with some schools for many years consecutively, and even they change every time. So there is a huge amount of variation there, and it's very difficult to. I don't think we want to pin it down too much, but that change is enormous, and it's not easy, just for pragmatic reasons, for schools to maintain a cohesive structure to their outdoor learning.
A quick comment. If you take Christine's school, it's a kind of peri-urban school, I suppose, with lots of opportunities because of where it's located. If you go up the road 200 metres to the Royal Mile Primary School, you'll see a school which has got not a blade of grass anywhere near it. And we've done some work with that school. One of my colleagues, Simon Beams, has done some extensive work with them. And the teachers wouldn't really have thought of taking the kids anywhere. When they let them out, they let them out into the playground. But we've been doing some work taking them down here to this green land out here and opening up their expectations of what they might do with those children. And so the urban and rural split is not really, it's not the only one, of course. There are so many nuances here, as Dave's just said. And a lot depends on the precise location and the staff and from year to year. The only way in which we will get more coherent, consistent provision for young people is for the inspectorate to look seriously at outdoor learning as part of their inspection regimes of primary schools, secondary schools, preschools and outdoor centres. We need the HMI to come in with the mindset that they actually want to look for this stuff, and when they look for it, they then need to report on it, and they need to report on good practice and less good practice. And then we'll start to sort these things out. And that means the inspectorate need to be trained in order to know what to look for in the first place.
The panel have emphasised the diversity between the different schools and their approaches. Are there any common factors that enable good practice in outdoor learning throughout the schools?
I think there are core elements in there that could easily be identified that are common across the board. I think there are common things that, you know, we've got a great school here with 18 acres of ground and stuff like that, and then you've got, you know, other schools that have got virtually nothing, and you've got primary schools sitting in the heart of the mountains, you know. So you've got huge diversity, but in amongst all of that, there is identifiable good practice in there, and there are core elements to that which you would, I guess Scottish Government's already identified in the various different documents you've actually produced, and we all actually try to implement, at least the quality places are trying to implement. I think there is a question of quality, and I think that's what Pete's actually implying here, and I think those are the areas of concern for everybody, and I think it should be the concern of the Scottish Government, that you want high quality outdoor learning for your young people, or outdoor education, whatever it is. You want high quality, whatever that is, and you want that delivered in a coherent way. I think at the moment that's one of the issues that stands. But I do think one of the good things is that the voluntary sort of groups, even the way these organisations, professional organisations, are working well together, along with Edinburgh University and other colleagues with examples of good practice in schools, and we're picking up in that, and Education Scotland are looking at that. And we are in a better place in that arena at the moment, taking it forward, but we need help with that. We're not getting over hurdles at the moment with that.
I just quote from your evidence, Professor Higgins, on this issue about quality assurance. Sorry, Colin, just wanted to check something. You stated in your written evidence to us in advance of today that despite political support, the absence of a coherent understanding of the nature of outdoor learning and its benefits by education authorities and teachers continues to limit quality. And you go on to discuss the quantity in different parts of it. Could you perhaps expand a little bit on that, on what seems to be a disconnect between the direction of travel, the political support, which seems reasonably coherent, and the statement you've made in your written evidence?
It's a question of timing now. You know, so as what makes things happen, to me, is the confluence of people, policy, and place. And so that we've been talking a bit about place. And we've been talking a bit about people, the people in schools who make things happen. And the policy is increasingly in favour of developing outdoor learning opportunities. Absolute credit to the people who've been involved in that process over the last few years. Now, local authorities haven't consistently applied the policy guidance. So, for example, the Curriculum for Excellence for Outdoor Learning, useful document. It's out there. Not everybody, but many people know it's there. But the guidance within it has not been consistently applied. So where you've got, if you take the panel of advisors, for example, where you've got advisors who have the ear of directors of education, who have got perhaps a good tradition, a good culture within the local authority, things are more likely to happen where that's the case than where that background isn't there. And so we've got understandably mixed provision across Scotland, and I think this will take time. But things that will help it will be more coherent and consistent policy coming forward from the Scottish Government, more from Education Scotland, and they've been doing quite a lot to help this over the last wee while, I must say, and perhaps a more determined push to make this an understandable and recognisable part of all the work that all education professionals are involved in, not just teachers in schools. And the work of General Teaching Council for Scotland is going to help in that process too.
Thank you. Given the comments that have been made about diversity and about consistency, I'm unclear what mechanisms are actually in place to ensure the spread of good practice, or indeed to learn from the various challenges that individual local authorities and schools might have encountered. I'm not sure how that happens.
Well, sharing good practice quite often takes place at the Scottish Advisory Panel, where all the advisors come together at regular meetings, and there is a sharing of good practice there, and there's presentations from each authority actually talking about what's actually been delivered there. So it gives us a good example of how diverse it is, to be honest with you. But it does show sometimes, what can be done with very small resources, and other times it actually shows us what's actually been done in authorities with enormous resources. Comparatively speaking, that it gives us an example of what can actually be achieved. But the diversity is the bit, I think, that's the problem for everybody. There's this interpretation of what is regular and frequent and what's an entitlement. That is a big problem. And local authorities, well, it's non-statutory. This is, even although it may well be your policy and it may well be that you'd like to see it happen, the reality of the situation is still an option. There's no head teacher out there, who has to comply with getting their children outdoors. It's a good thing if they do it, but they're more interested in seeing what their exam results are quite often. And so the other side of things are actually almost, I'm not going to say they're discarded, but we're up against that sort of problem at the moment. So it's not statutory, it's something that's good to happen.
Just to come back on the first question I asked, I don't think I really got an answer to it, which was, how common is it actually for schools in Scotland to offer a diverse programme on outdoor learning? Is it very patchy? I haven't got really my head around whether it's most schools do it, whether a few schools do it, whether some local authorities do it, or all local authorities do it, or are we back to this diverse approach again, where it's just a bit of a lottery?
In my organisation, we see over 250 teachers a year, over 2,000 teachers a year from 250 different schools. And there is a huge amount of variability in what they are looking for. Some of them are absolutely excellent. They see the connection between outdoor learning and curriculum for excellence, and they get their sleeves rolled up and they're getting stuck in. And others sometimes occasionally want to watch from a distance, possibly from a deck chair with a glass of white wine. No, a joke. But that range is quite enormous. It is difficult, I think, for some teachers to understand what the potential is for outdoor learning. Everybody has a very fixed idea of what outdoor learning is. As soon as you mention the phrase, people think about helmets and harnesses and muddy boots. But that is just the tools of the trade. That is what helps us to get young people into learning situations. But we do need to concentrate more on the quality agenda. We have recently, in recent years, put in tenders, local authority tenders, on a few occasions, and they will ask us things like, how many accidents have there been? How many activities can children use? There is no question about quality at all. Just because it's difficult to measure quality doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. We should, we can, and we should. So I think there is that urgency to focus on the quality side of things. There is that diversity, sorry to use that word again, that we need to be able to project a more positive message, a more positive vision about the potential of outdoor learning in its widest sense. Still, despite a couple of strategic advisory groups in recent years.
I'm slightly conscious of time, so I've got a few areas still to cover we haven't done well with. So, Liam, have you got a brief supplementary in this area?
Intrigued by some of what Dave said there and earlier, Christine's comments about trying to get a handle on the expertise and where the passion is amongst staff for doing this. Are qualifications an inhibitor, or is what is required is a degree of understanding, a degree of enthusiasm and willingness to, as Dave says, get your sleeves rolled up and get involved?
think, yes, to the latter, but I think as a school what you also need to do is invest in your staff, and if they want to go away and get trained up in something, then we will try and find the funding for that, for them to do that.
The absence of the qualification there isn't an inhibitor.
No, it's not an inhibitor, and I also think it's very important that we don't just look at staff in schools. It's really good for our youngsters to get the opportunity of working with other people and going to outdoor centres and being with other staff and seeing other people doing things and seeing teachers in a different light, not in the light where they're leading things, but in the light where they're actually learning at the same time as well. I think that's very important.
On that point, I was going to ask whether or not, in terms of good practice, there is good practice of schools working collaboratively to maybe get round the issue of whether or not you have all the skill sets that you need within your school, collaboratively acting with others. I mean, in an Orkney situation, for example, given the size and scale of some of the schools, you'll find schools coming together and engaging in outdoor education, either within Orkney or south, going to Laganlee or whatever. And that allows them to provide an offering that probably wouldn't have been there were they to try and do it on their own. Is that something that happens elsewhere as a matter of course?
I think there's a great need for a CPD type budget for school staff. I think helping staff to become better educated about the outdoors and being trained in it gives confidence and allows people to get out there. Our advisory panel would definitely, they would put a plea in to try and assist them with the training of staff, because for every person you train, you're actually multiplying the impact. And at the moment, there's less and less skill. You know, I do think that, to answer Mr. Beattie, I think we're patchy, but we're getting less patchy. But I think things like CPD, good constructive CPD, would be with firm sort of views on how to get staff engaged, I think would be helpful. If our advisory panel had, you know, a CPD budget, we're actually already trying to deliver training on for coordinators of you know, visits, you know, to try and encourage, to help people with that, so that we can try and take away some of the myths and try and help enable people to actually make judgments about where to take people. So we're going to deliver that training ourselves, but we've no budget for that. We're hoping to try and do that. That would be a great help for schools, because it gives a school, a person in each school who's actually got the ability to actually make a judgment call without fear, you know, because a lot of these are myths and people are having to learn that whole process, and the head teacher themselves having to work through a set of procedures to see how they can actually get children out of doors. That's quite a difficult thing. Whereas if you can actually provide a course that just trains someone up to understand those, and it's a day course, and you go away with the tools after that to actually get young people out of doors in whichever environment, then that's a worthy cause. But there's lots of examples of that, but there's no budget for that at the moment, and I think it's important. Sorry.
Can I just come in there? Very briefly, Midlothian actually do have an outdoor learning service, and we do get that kind of training, and it is very, very useful for staff. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Professor Higgins wanted a
very briefly. Just imagine something came into schools called computers, right? Just suppose this was a new thing. You would want to train the staff in how to use them. And what we have here is a concept of outdoor learning and outdoor education, whatever the continuum is, that needs proper training for staff to fully make use of it. And that needs good quality CPD, but the quality of the CPD needs to be assured in the first place. There are any number of people who will jump into this area and start selling their wares without the skills and background to do it properly. And I think there again, we just need to be careful that we make sure we've got good quality right at the start, so we train teachers properly so they understand what they're doing. Thank you. Bill Bibby.
Thanks. Just wanted to ask you some questions about barriers to increasing provision, and particularly around the aspects of cost. We've talked a lot about the difference between urban and rural schools. However, it strikes me that there's a big difference between schools in deprived areas and schools in affluent areas when it comes to accessing outdoor learning. I know there's different aspects and different categories of it, but there are schools in urban areas that can fund annual field trips and various other things because the parents in those areas can afford it. But there's obviously lots of schools in in urban areas, but possibly in rural areas as well, that can't afford to these kind of further kind of field trips. I just wanted, obviously there'll be exceptions to the rule, I would imagine, but I just wanted to see, is that generally what you think the case is? Do you think that's acceptable, and what do you think should be done to kind of make sure that all children, regardless of their family income, can have this access to all the aspects of outdoor learning? I know there's different aspects to that.
I come from North Ayrshire, so we've got a fair degree of deprivation there, and a third of the children that come to our centre at the moment come free of charge. But that privilege is challenged now because of the austerity measures that are hitting all councils at the moment, and it's almost certain that at some stage these children will definitely have to pay. Now that could have an impact on them. Now we're looking at other ways of supporting them, but it's very serious actually, and I think equal opportunity, and equity should be an important thing for you to consider, and I do think it's going to impact in the future because of the lack of budgets and support for children. And I think it's a really great thing that you asked that question, because deprivation is really serious and it will affect their opportunities.
Christine?
As a school, what we try and do is we will fund youngsters who are not able to pay. They'll maybe pay a small contribution and we will find money to fund the rest. I've used John Watson Trust and organisations like that to fund places, and that really helps. Having said that, that is only the odd one or two youngster. The parents will be picking up quite a lot of the cost when it's going away, say, to Benmore or somewhere like that. We fundraise through a sponsored walk, and part of that money gets put to one side so that we can enable youngsters to go out on trips and pay for it if there is a problem with them doing that. So I think it's a case of trying to use budgets creatively and make use of them, and people feel that they can be included, and that the cost of something is not stopping them from taking part. We will go a long way to try and sort that out.
As much as Christine will look for people who are motivated about outdoor learning, I think some schools also look for teachers who are motivated about raising money. They're really quite ingenious in the way they can get money, not just from bagpacking, but a whole range of different methods. But it is a drain on the staff, and I think what we see is that we are getting the same number of young people, the same number of groups and schools and organisations coming to us, but with fewer children. And this is a worry, because teachers want equity in general. They want all of their children to benefit from that experience. And if it achieves a certain percentage, I don't know what that is, but it might achieve a certain point where they say, well, it's not right, because we're adding burden to the school from those who have to stay behind, and there's the threat then that will say, well, actually we can't put it together. So that is a concern.
And it's not just for residential provision as well. There are plenty of schools where they have zero budgets for local outdoor learning opportunities. I can think of a school not very far from Christine's where the budget for outdoor learning is zero. There's a teacher who does the work, but she has to raise all of the money for everything herself, including if the kids need gloves, she just goes and buys them because there's no other provision. So if we want to take this seriously, I think we need to think about skilling the staff within the schools and not divert their attention always towards trying to raise funds in order to keep the minimal service going, because that is truly the case in some places. Leave alone the prospect of going to residential, which for some kids is fantasy land because of the schools having no funds to support them at all.
It was mentioned earlier that about, obviously cuts to local government budgets. I mean, do you think there is a danger that the cost of outdoor learning will prove to be too much for local authorities and place too much of a burden on families to meet the cost of such activities?
Start on that, because I don't want to hog this part of the conversation, because it's essentially one of the reasons I've been certainly a proponent of local outdoor learning opportunities is at least to get the kids out, all right, so they understand their local place and they get to do some things outdoors. That's the minimum. We need to be thinking of this as a progressive endeavour, just right back to the start of the discussion today. So it's not the one or the other, it's progressive. The budgets are really tight. but there's an awful lot you can do without money. But there is a really interesting question of equity. My daughter just recently went to an outdoor centre, and I was minded almost to write to the head teacher to say, please explain why I'm having to pay £250 for this experience. If this is curricular, if it's valuable, if it's in term time, why is it that I'm being expected to pay at all for my daughter to go? We don't ask children to pay for other things. So I think there's an interesting question here. I'm not trying to diss the idea that we do ask parents to supplement their children's education. What I'm saying is there is an issue of principle, particularly for kids with no income, parents with no income or low income.
Do you think then that there should, if there is no outdoor learning budget in areas or across certain areas, do you think there should be an outdoor learning budget?
There should be...
Or a budget for those activities?
Yeah, of course there should be provision to support children who have no opportunity for finding funds from any other source. And that's what traditionally Christine School and other schools have done. And through the local authorities there have been budgets. But as Nigel said, these things are being cut and there's very little opportunity now. As for whether there should be a dedicated outdoor educational budget, I don't really think so. I think this is about good quality education. There is no distinction to me between good quality indoor and good quality outdoor education. It's up for the schools to decide, but it's up for us and yourselves to decide what the policy might be and what areas of Scottish education need to be pushed and promoted. With evidence, there needs to be evidence behind this.
Sorry, just 1 second. I just want to clarify something. You know, I'm a parent of a child at secondary school who's been on outdoor, on residential weekends and other activities, and of course I was asked to contribute and gladly did so. But my understanding was I was contributing to the food and accommodation, not the actual learning as such. So therefore, that seems to be entirely reasonable, because when my child goes to school during the day, they come home in the evening, and therefore the school's not paying for their accommodation.
True everywhere. No. It's absolutely not true.
I do think that that's a very fair and reasonable way to go about it, and I would say that that's what happens in the centre that I manage. But there are some children who are seriously challenged, and they're actually probably living on far less than what we would charge. Okay, that's a definite case. We've had the deprivation sometimes is so severe, it's shocking actually what we have come into our place. And you know, we help out. Is that the best way? I think that's the best way to put that without going into too much detail. So I actually do think that somewhere along the line, I think because of the social, some of the children that come to us are actually there and getting respite. You know, they're actually carers in their own homes. You know, some of the children that come to us don't sleep in a warm bed at night. We're giving them the opportunity to see an alternative in their life. We're giving them a chance actually to aspire to a different world. We used to be challenged actually at times. Somebody used to say, had various people in the past saying to me, you know, this is a one-off experience, how can it be meaningful? I realise even more relevant today than it was in the past is the chance of actually showing young people in Scotland there is an alternative. And there are nice people out there who will be knowledgeable friends and take you out and in the fresh air and enjoy the Scottish environment without it being too complicated, actually, to be honest with you. But even in a place like Arran, you know, to go on 1 hour in a ferry from the place where they live, it's a completely different environment, and they can enjoy that and they're safe. I'm not saying that all the children that come to us are like that. There are middle-class children who are the same, suffer the same sort of different, slightly different sort of deprivation, but are still deprived, and they've got parents who maybe don't get the amount of time that they maybe require. Our people sometimes give that. There are role models in these centres, people who young men would like to, you know, aspire to, where there's so many single-parent families and so on. I could go on. There are lots and lots of things that are happening now that have changed over the role of an outdoor centre these days is quite different from where it was in the past. The adventurous activities that these people are delivering quite often take children into an arena where they're only working with one man or another lady who actually gives them a nice role model, somebody they can communicate with and talk to in a way that they maybe can't do at home. All those sort of things are valuable. And I think, you know, the role of an outdoor centre is slightly different. I mean, I think as an entitlement, I think it should be there for everybody, personally.
Again, I'm going to bring you in first, Dave, but I'm going to, because Liam wanted to come in on this area. I think.
I'm happy to hear what Dave's saying.
Okay, first, okay, Dave.
It's really quite important that we do take a look at how the whole of the residential, all of outdoor learning is financed, not just residential. I will promote residential, of course. I think it's a good idea, but there are there are other types of outdoor learning that are valuable and essential, I think, in this whole picture. But we, at the last strategic advisory group, had the opportunity to make recommendations on the financing of outdoor learning and even the contribution of philanthropic support for it. And it's to my, I'm embarrassed to say that that didn't happen. I was a member of that group, and I would have liked to have seen more emphasis on the financing of outdoor learning. But we didn't broach it, and at one point we were told we wouldn't because of sensitivities. Now, what these sensitivities can be in a government strategic advisory group, I don't know. But it blocked the whole discussion about the financing of outdoor learning. And that is crackers, absolutely crackers. You know, we had an opportunity there to look at the whole landscape of outdoor learning, to look at all the different providers, to look at what they offered, what were the learning outcomes, what were the costs of what they were doing and how they could gear up. And we didn't do that. And I don't know how you can create a give strategic advice to ministers without knowing what's out there and how much it costs. I do think that there have been some fairly profligate uses of money in the past, which many people would like not to see happen again. But this needs transparency in how things are funded, and it needs some sort of, again, this bringing together, this cohesion about how we can best serve all of our young people to get all of these different experiences.
Thank you. Christine, do you want to add in at this point, and then I'll bring in Liam?
No, I think
It's been covered, okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Thanks very much. Liam?
I mean, I'm glad I let Dave come in first, because in the sense he's answered the question I was going to pose. But I mean, in terms of talking about, we've heard the need to bring together policy, people and place, but absent from that, quite conspicuously, is the issue of resource. I suppose how you give effect to policy, how you support people, and how you deliver place in a way that's accessible. So I'd be interested to know the panel's views on how we do open up a debate about how we properly resource this. And added to that, I think from what's been said so far, is there a risk at the moment about the provision that's currently available still being available in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, if we don't crack this issue of resource?
I'll make a start. And I hope this helps. I came from a practical background, and at the time I was working in the field, there was no expectation that there was anything other than the costs of food and travel, as the convener said, for a residential provision. Within schools, there was no expectation of any costs whatsoever, where children did local outdoor learning. We now have a mixed model where you've got some local authority provision within the schools, local authority provision in centres, you've got charitable trusts, and you've got commercial provision. And that happens in residentials, but it happens with regard to providers that people might use in and around schools as well. So to me, the issue is one of equity. We've talked about that. And then what is a sufficient budget stream that would support meaningful outdoor learning within schools and beyond to outdoor centres. I go back to the issue of training the teachers in the first place. You need to train them. You need to train them before they start. You need to select them so they're interested in the outdoors. You need to train them in in-service provision. You need to make sure there's an appropriate supply of advisory staff within local authorities so that they can advise the schools properly, so that they can then spend what money they do have properly, even before we've started to deal with schools' budgets. So, for example, I could point you to outdoor centres, which are essentially activity holiday centres, where the children, there's no educational benefit that I can see that's described for the work that they do. I'm not talking about the work these guys do. I'm talking about commercial providers that charge significant amounts of money and make a good profit from it. So if we have got money, and it's parents' money, or it's coming from a budget, we need to make sure that it's used wisely. I would go for some form of provision within the local authorities in order to make sure that schools knew what they were doing, and then to think about how we support residential provision, particularly because budgets are not endless for those children who cannot find funds themselves, the top-up model that Christine talked about earlier on. Yes, it would be lovely to have millions and millions of pounds to provide support for everyone, but that's not going to happen. So we need to start from where we are and see where we can get to.
It's a big question, isn't it? I go back to my first, I think probably one of my first statements, that we need to look at partnership working. There are a lot of organisations out there with good people who want to do this work, and they want to interface with formal education in an effective way. If we are to have that development in partnership working as we want, I think we have to provide CPD for what partnership working is. We have lost the knack within local authorities, I think, to benefit or see the benefits of partnership working. But this is really where the future has to be. This is not going to go away, the issue of partnership working. We must use all the resource that we have, and that comes from sometimes in different places from where we might expect. So in order to unleash that, we have to look at how we're going to encourage those in schools, those in local authorities, to recognise the benefits to themselves from partnership working. I think too that we need to recognise that a lot of this creativity, imaginative work that has been forthcoming has come from third sector providers. The Duke of Edinburgh Award, the John Muir Award, these are fascinating concepts that have emerged from the third sector. And we really need to look at supporting organisations that have that creativity about them, and particularly avoid the converse of that, and that is where a public agency might seek to take control or hold of some of those creative ideas because they think it's an easy option for them to stay in the game, to stay a part of the outdoor learning world. But really that leads to this creativity being stifled.
To answer the question, I think it is in danger. I think the opportunities that existed for children in the past are definitely shrinking. There were 12 outdoor centres in Strathclyde. There are now 2 local authority-owned centres. So you have to say that's significant. There are already initiatives being made by the few local authority centres that exist at the moment. Some of them have been used as cash cows, so they're actually expected to recover money more than the zero budget. So they've been given financial targets above their zero budget situation, which is quite concerning to me. The other bit is, in some centres are actually been asked to shrink the availability to the local authority schools so that they can bring in money from outside agencies to offset the costs of running the local authority. Now that's because the budget pressures really. Now I don't think that was ever the intention. I've spoken to some ministers before and some policy makers for Scottish Government, and they've told me that quite clearly that was never the intention, that that policy was to make sure that these things were available for young people, that young people engage in the outdoors, the real outdoors, authentic experiences and so on. So I would say to the committee that there's a serious challenge there, and if you want to preserve this for the future of young people, you need to think very carefully about it and how you're going to support it, because it's under threat. Mm-hmm. It's very definitely under threat.
The only thing I would add, I really don't have the knowledge to comment on budget at all. The only thing I would add is that over the years, where we have got additional monies coming into school and it's actually ring-fenced, that's actually been really useful, because it then can't be touched at all by other people, and you can then do work with that money. So if that's going to be on the agenda of putting more money into school for this kind of thing, it might be that you say that some of the money that's coming to school for Curriculum for Excellence, some of it has to be channeled down the outdoor learning route. That might be very beneficial.
Okay. Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. We've heard this morning about quality, how to ensure quality, how do we get consistency, what works, what doesn't work, what are the barriers to improvement, and how do we fund all this? And I'm wondering what you think, what role curriculum for excellence can play in that? And there's been some reference to it in earlier answers. So do you think that there's scope to nail some of this down through the curriculum for excellence process?
I'll come in first of all. I think over the next couple of years, in secondary schools, when teachers have become au fait with the new qualifications and they're beginning to feel more comfortable and more at ease with assessment arrangements, I think then we'll start to see much more outdoor learning taking off in the secondary school. I know that in first to third year it's not as much as an issue, but staff are really very, very focused on the new qualifications at the moment and making sure that they get that right for our youngsters. So I think, yes, it will be developing as we go through, but at the moment I would suggest that probably a lot of emphasis in school is actually looking to the senior years to get that sorted out. Okay.
I would agree with that. We're already seeing, well, obviously skills development is pretty well embedded in what we're doing. Across the country, colleagues are working and have embedded curriculum for excellence in what they're actually doing. So it's you know, experiences and outcomes and all these sort of things are all embedded in what we're trying to do. It's within these strategy documents I explained earlier on. So that's all part and parcel. I think it already exists. It's the implementation part of that that's sort of taken some time to make that actually happen. But I think we're making progress in that. I think it's a time thing. And the secondary level, certainly because of the new qualifications, there's a much more practical aspect to do with some of the social subjects. And already we've had quite a lot of inquiries about that, and our colleagues are actually looking at how to implement that. And they're actually having to cross-border skills, you know, and use, you know, different people who've got, you know, skills in adjacent authorities to try and use that to work collaboratively to try and deliver on that agenda. So there's things like that happening that are very positive. But we're kind of starting along that route, and that's another good example of, you know, the Scottish Advisory Panel working along with schools and so on. Dave.
Danger of being contentious here. As I said, I see lots of different teachers, and one who I admire enormously came to me and said, love to see what you're doing here, love to see the rapport of the tutors, the formative assessment approach, but thank goodness they're not talking about curriculum for excellence because we're sick of it. I think it will emerge over time. And I suppose I want to tie that into, that's that diversity thing again, isn't it? But I want to tie that into this concern that, you know, Peter has mentioned that there's a lot of work going into new teachers about preparing for outdoor learning, but we've got a lot of teachers who were trained pre-curriculum for excellence, and they're still with us, and they will be with us for decades to come. So I would just turn it a little bit on its head and suggest that outdoor learning can be a useful medium in which teachers can come together and learn new ways of doing things, learn about curriculum for excellence. The outdoors can provide a forum in which you can have interdisciplinary learning, which I think is a bit of a hurdle in some secondary schools. So to me, it's not so much what curriculum for excellence can do for us, but what we can do for curriculum for excellence.
You okay? That's fine. Yeah,
Keep quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up. So what could the Scottish Government, Education Scotland or the General Teaching Council for Scotland do to help to push this agenda?
Shall I make a start then? Well, first of all, in a way, we don't have a choice insofar as it has already been partially, at least, embedded in expectation and policy through Curriculum for Excellence through Outdoor Learning, the General Teaching Council's professional standards and Education Scotland's work plans. So they are already doing stuff. And I think the first thing is that expectations need to be raised, that this is what every teacher is going to have to do, irrespective of whether or not they're pre-Curriculum for Excellence or not. This is your job, okay, and you need to do this. To me, that is the most profound element of this, is that there is this expectation, which is a part of professional requirements of teachers in the future. So I would like to see further guidance, further support through Education Scotland and collaborative work with the General Teaching Council, and much of that's already happening. In addition to that, I think there's an issue of priority here. Much of what happens in schools at the moment is quite clearly defined within curricular subject areas, and we've talked already about interdisciplinarity. But if I could make one plea to you, it would be this. In less than a year's time, we're going to be having a debate on the future of Scotland. We're going to have the debate. We're having the debate already, but there'll be a decision. To me, we have something through outdoor learning that is quintessentially about the nature of this nation. So we've talked about education. We haven't talked about environment. So children will not understand their environment without spending time in it. If you think about physical activity and recreation, many of us are of a certain age. We don't play soccer anymore, we don't play netball, we don't play any of those games, but we might continue to hill walk. And so there's elements of physical activity and well-being that I think we need to consider. There's the issue of the green tourism and recreation in the landscape that we have around us. There's culture, heritage and history. All of this stuff is about the outdoors. There's green energy, it's about the outdoors. There's agriculture, forestry, fisheries and food about the outdoors. You cannot understand this place that we live in without thinking about the land and the landscape and the people. And to me, that is by far the strongest argument for getting kids outdoors now. And I would love to see this committee and our ministers actually saying, this is a priority, we need to do this, it's about the nation. It's not about curriculum for excellence as part of it. This is something else above and beyond that. And it would be lovely to think that we have a debate about the nature of our nation once the decision of next September is over and done with.
Dave.
Peter's been very eloquent about explaining a lot of the broader connections to what we're about, quite rightly so. But I think for me it would be a matter of just bringing that all together again and saying who is responsible for this, who's going to take a lead from this. I think this, I really welcome the fact that you've asked us to come in today, and I hope you take a regular and ongoing interest in this, because it needs to be led from the top and it needs to be directed in such a way that you're able to keep an eye on this. Because we have been down this road before, we have looked to create a more strategic approach and it hasn't quite connected up. There are different ways of doing things and we should look to do them in different ways. But the key thing is who's responsible. I mentioned earlier that there's a bit of sport, a bit of health and well-being in here, a bit of education, a bit of youth policy. But we're falling between all of these different interests and it's doing us a disservice. So it needs to be pulled together and coordinated.
I would endorse everything that Dave said there, and Pete, you know, I think it's a bigger picture is the important thing, and I do agree that that we have fallen within 4 different policy units, and quite often we don't get any, who is the master here? We end up being bumped from one place to another. It's not so much that we're a disparate group, we're actually a pretty well coordinated group. We all know what we love, but we just can't get anybody to take actual responsibility for us, and that is the truth of the matter. I think getting back to Education Scotland and you know what could be happening there at the moment, I think Education Scotland is fairly well focused on outdoor learning, and the progression bit has kind of disappeared a little bit off the agenda. And I think if we want to climb mountains and go to sea and see the value of that, that needs to be reinforced again, and maybe even something to do with residential and the value of that. Because our communications with Education Scotland, we have very good communications with Education Scotland. We work very closely with Education Scotland, but we have to constantly remind them that, excuse me, there is another element here. And I think that's important that should be done. And then curriculum for excellence, we love it. We think it's great. We think it's the greatest thing that ever happened to the outdoors. But we'd love to see the opportunity to develop it further.
Kristen?
I don't really have very much more to offer. You've all been very eloquent in that. I think from a school's point of view, it would be good to have to know who's running all this, where we can go for advice, and it's the same across the whole country rather than the way it is at the moment. Although you obviously need local things happening, there needs to be one body really, I think. And I think a plea from the heart, funding for the outdoor centres really needs to be a priority, because there are many things that we can do in schools, but we can't do it without these people, and the youngsters will not get the same experience. It's very, very important that they exist.
very much. We really are right up against the wire in time, but Joan, I know, has got a supplementary in this area and some other
yeah,
questions.
my supplementary actually relates exactly to the point that Peter made. The part of the country I represent in the south of Scotland, Glasgow University at the Crichton campus has opened a centre, the Solway Centre for Environment and Culture, which has projects such as community archaeology, and which actually links people with their heritage through the environment. Now, just to kind of develop what you were saying, the government is supposed to be developing a strand called Scottish Studies in the curriculum, which would link all these things. Is that happening? I mean, is that having an effect on outdoor education? Has it touched your area at all?
Don't know quite how to answer this. I mean, Scottish Studies, of course, there was a ministerial advisory group, and then the report was published, and eventually I was asked in to give some comment in the latter stages of that, and I made pretty much the point I've just made just now, that this is integral. The landscape is integral to Scottish Studies, and I'm not familiar with the rate of progress, but to me, if we have a strand within education that's on Scottish Studies, it must focus on the landscape as much as it can focus on anything else. And outdoor learning can support that. The same is true of the other ministerial advisory group I was involved in, the One Planet Schools group, which led to Learning for Sustainability as a report. You cannot have sustainability as a theme without thinking about the land and the landscape. So there are ways here in which these two major areas of educational development should come together so that we actually take the landscape and place as a kind of core element of this. And I think then we'll have some stuff to really sing about. Scotland has got a great reputation in this area. I think we can become... We are amongst the world-leading nations at the moment, but I think we can really set our stall out if we pull these things together.
I think it happens by default, to be honest with you. You know, if you're working out of doors, I think Scottish Studies is happening. You know, but people don't know it's Scottish Studies, and it's never been. You know, as far as I think you'll have seen in my submission that a whole load of people don't even know what it is. So it's not got from policy level down to grassroots. It just hasn't happened, but it is happening accidentally. I think that's the best way to put it.
I will just add one little thing here. I think it's very important because I do know youngsters in schools don't know where bits and pieces are in Scotland. When you ask them where, well, you know, you ask them where the Outer Hebrides, they have not got a clue. You know, so I think it's really important that we get the message across about our country. It's very, very important they know about it. You know, they'll go to the south of France, Spain on their holidays, and they've probably never been any further north than Brecon, somewhere like that, you know.
At this point, you're covered, okay. Did you want to ask some questions about the learning for sustainability?
Excuse me, Convener, sorry, I thought somebody else was coming in there.
No.
Yes, it's the sustainability strategy, which Professor Higgins mentioned. Now, as I understand, there's 31 recommendations in learning for sustainability. Could you give us some indication as to where we are in terms of linking that to outdoor education?
Yes, okay, so the Alistair Minister responded last March by accepting all 31 recommendations, almost all of them in full, and the 5 key recommendations were accepted in full. So that was March. Now, the normal process then is that an implementation group is set up, and that was one of the expectations, and that was agreed. The implementation group was due to start work as soon as practical. It turns out that the staff who were involved in the advisory group were then moved to other duties, and it's taken a while to get the replacement staff in post to set this up, and those staff have then had to put together an implementation group. In other words, what experts do they need in here, what advice do they need. And the last stages of this are taking place at the moment. There are almost all members of the group have been decided upon, but there are 1 or 2 that they've just been trying to tidy up and make sure are ready to start work in probably January 2014.
And specifically, I know that one of the recommendations is about school buildings and grounds and policies. Obviously, in the past, some schools have been built under PFI. Is that causing difficulties in terms of outdoor learning and sustainability?
Yes. Well, all forms of school buildings, of course, generate difficulties with regard to sustainability issues. The new regulations that are being brought in are ones that should bring buildings up to an appropriate standard. But you do have specific issues where there's a PFI system or a PPP system. And the reason for that is, of course, you can't modify those buildings. But actually, most schools don't have the money to modify the buildings in the first place. This is a much bigger issue. But that modification of buildings is a problem, yes.
Anything to add on that?
Well, working in a school that's actually 30 years old and is needing a fair bit of work done on it, and we struggle to find the funding to do that. We really do. So I think school buildings. Having said that, we have tapped into the local community to run projects in the ground. One of the things that's just up and running at the moment is a local gardening company have actually come in and done some work for us and producing a garden. The youngsters are going to be able to grow things in it. And, you know, it's really very good to be able to do that. But the school building itself is another matter. Okay.
A few years ago, an Edinburgh architect designed a primary school for, I think it was a primary school for Norway, northern Norway, and it was heated by lamps and the body heat of children. I don't think people necessarily see the potential or the opportunities of developing schools for saving money. We seem to think that if you're adding green elements on, it's a cost. It doesn't have to be that way. There are zero energy buildings around Europe. I don't think we have that many in this country yet. Sorry, I'm straying from outdoor learning, aren't I? But nevertheless, I think there are opportunities there. It comes back to this change that I refer to, the change and the opportunities of change. It doesn't have to be a negative change. It doesn't have to be negative all the time.
If I can add just a brief note. First of all, children pick up on what we do as adults. And there's heaps of research evidence that shows that what you do matters much more than what you say. And that's true of the buildings, which is one of the reasons why this is important. But the same is true of procurement as well. And there are many restrictions on the ways in which local authorities operate, and schools therefore operate, that mean that they don't necessarily buy in ways that are both ethical and can save money, and thirdly, demonstrate the importance of ethical procurement and then therefore ethical expenditure to young people. And so you're touching on something that is a major issue structurally in terms of our infrastructure and indeed our practice within schools.
I've seen a few places, the PFI buildings. I think my understanding from colleagues is that the majority of head teachers are very much involved in the design and process, but whether that actually works its way through to the final building is a different question. You know, quite often the finances of things will dictate what actually happens, and quite often it will be the outdoor type things that might be able to be sacrificed in these things. But there are some great examples that I have seen of gardens in schools, and in fact there's one school I know that's got little plots right through the town. You know, we've got little bits growing things, and there's great examples of that. And you know, head teachers taking the initiative of having traverse walls put into their schools and so on for climbing, and these are great examples. But there's no strategic advice, I think, with regard to creating outdoor spaces and so on, and you know, and having children moving around in the outdoors, getting to classrooms like we used to do in the past. There's no kind of emphasis on light and so on that I'm aware of.
In terms of the issue that you raised about procurement, you'll be aware that the government has a procurement bill going through Parliament at the moment. Are you hopeful that that will help add the kind of clarity to move towards more ethical procurement? Because my understanding is that quite a lot of the people in local authorities who might be in charge of procurement are concerned about, you know, European rules and so on, and that sometimes they err too much on the side of caution.
I can't really respond because I don't know what's in the bill, but I would certainly hope that we would, whatever the bill does, it should take ethical issues like this into consideration as well. And it's not always about the apparent cost as well. Sometimes you can save money by spending more. We all know that. If I can have one point, my wife works in a PFI school, and none of these things would be possible in that school. She works as an outdoor teacher. She could not build a garden. She could not put a climbing wall up. She could not do any of those things. And I know that from personal experience. So there are many variations in the way in which this practice occurs. But no, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Can I thank all of the witnesses this morning for giving us their evidence. It's been extremely interesting and extremely helpful. No doubt we will discuss the matter further amongst ourselves about where we go from here. But thank you very much for coming along this morning, as I say, and giving us your evidence. And can I suspend briefly? Our third item today is to consider two negative instruments, the first of which is the Adoption, Recognition of Overseas Adoptions Scotland Regulations, and the second of which is the Adoption, Recognition of Overseas Adoptions Scotland Amendment Regulations. The second instrument amends the first. Taken together, the instruments specify the countries and territories whose adoption orders are recognised as overseas adoptions in Scots law. Can I ask, do any members have any comments on these instruments? No? Okay. Therefore, does the committee agree to make no recommendation to the Parliament on these instruments? Agreed. Thank you. As our next item is in private, I close the meeting to the public.